Athens. Summer. 430 BC. The city is at the absolute height of its civilization. The Parthenon is under construction on the Acropolis, still decades from completion, its marble columns rising against the Attic sky in a building program that is simultaneously a religious monument and a statement of imperial confidence. The Agora below is the most sophisticated public space in the ancient world, where philosophers argue in public and citizens vote on laws in the same afternoon. The fleet of 200 triremes in the harbour at Piraeus makes Athens the dominant naval power in the Aegean. The silver mines of Laurion, worked by slaves in conditions of extraordinary brutality, generate the revenues that fund the fleet, the building program, and the democratic institutions that Pericles has spent his career constructing. Athens is not simply a powerful city, it is an idea. The democracy that Cleisthenes designed and Pericles extended is the first in history. Imperfect, exclusionary by modern standards, built on slavery and the systematic subordination of women, but genuinely radical in its premise that free male citizens have the right to govern themselves. The drama festivals, the philosophy, the architecture, the naval empire, the democratic constitution, all of it is happening simultaneously, in one city, in one generation. Then a ship arrives from the east. Nobody knows exactly where the disease comes from. Thucydides, the historian who will write the most devastating first-person account of what follows, and who survives the plague himself, says it begins in Ethiopia, passes through Egypt and Libya, and arrives in Athens through the port of Piraeus. By the time the city understands that it is not dealing with an ordinary outbreak, it is too late to contain. What arrives in Athens in the summer of 430 BC kills approximately 25 to 30% of the entire population, perhaps 75,000 to 100,000 people in a city that holds between 300,000 and 400,000 when the population crowded in from the surrounding countryside is counted. Among the military, the losses are proportionally even higher. Among the leadership class, the losses are catastrophic in ways that go beyond numbers. What the plague kills in Athens is not simply people. It kills the social contract, the democratic self-belief, and the specific combination of conditions that had produced the most creative civilization in Western history. The golden age of Athens does not end in a military defeat or a political revolution. It ends in a disease whose identity modern scientists still argue about, in a summer so hot that the bodies piled up faster than the living could bury them. To understand what the plague destroys, it is necessary to understand what Athens has become by 430 BC, because what is lost is not simply population, but a specific, irreplaceable moment in the development of human civilization. Athens in 430 BC is the product of 50 years of extraordinary political and cultural acceleration. The Persian Wars, the invasions of Darius and Xerxes in 490 and 480 BC, had threatened to end Greek civilization entirely. The Athenian decision to abandon the city before Xerxes arrived, trust the wooden walls of their fleet, and fight at Salamis is one of the most consequential strategic gambles in ancient history. It works. The Persian fleet is destroyed in the narrow straits of Salamis. The invasion collapses. Athens, returning to a burned city, rebuilds with the confidence of a people who have defeated the largest empire on earth. The money that funds the rebuilding comes from a source discovered at exactly the right moment. In 483 BC, the Athenians discover a new rich vein of silver in the Laurion mines. The politician Themistocles argues, against considerable opposition, that this windfall should be used to build a fleet rather than distributed to citizens as a dividend. The fleet is built, it wins at Salamis, it becomes the foundation of the Athenian maritime empire, the Delian League, nominally an alliance of Aegean city-states for mutual defense against Persia. In practice, an Athenian tribute empire whose member cities pay into a treasury that Athens controls and increasingly spends on its own building program. The tribute finances the Parthenon. It finances the long walls connecting Athens to its harbour at Piraeus, the strategic infrastructure that makes Athens effectively unconquerable by land, since it can always be resupplied by sea. It finances the democratic institutions that Pericles expands: payment for jury service, payment for attending the assembly, making participation in democracy economically possible for citizens who cannot afford to take the day off from work. The empire funds the democracy. The democracy produces the culture generates the philosophy, the drama, the architecture, the scientific thinking that will shape Western civilization for 2.5 millennia. The cultural output of this single generation in this single city is so disproportionate to what any previous civilization has produced that historians still struggle to explain it. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides are all writing and performing simultaneously. Socrates is arguing in the Agora. Herodotus, the first historian, is writing and reading his work publicly. Phidias is overseeing the sculptural program of the Parthenon. Hippocrates is developing the foundations of rational medicine on the island of Kos, in the intellectual atmosphere that Athenian culture has made possible across the Aegean. The density of genius in this moment and place has no parallel in the ancient world, and very few in the modern one. It is not a coincidence. It is the product of a specific set of conditions: democratic participation, commercial wealth, imperial confidence, and the competitive culture of the festival and the law court, that amplify and reward intellectual achievement in ways no previous society has managed. Pericles, who dominates Athenian politics throughout this period, understands the system he is managing with unusual clarity. He knows the empire is an empire, that the tribute paid by allied cities is not voluntary but coerced. He knows the democracy is limited, that the 300,000 slaves who work the silver mines and the farms and the households of Athens have no voice in it. He knows the Spartan alliance is fragile and that war with Sparta is probably inevitable. What he does not know, what no one in Athens or anywhere else can know, is that the specific combination of conditions producing this extraordinary moment is uniquely fragile, and that a disease arriving from a ship in Piraeus harbor is about to destroy it in a single summer. The plague arrives in a city that has made itself maximally vulnerable to exactly this kind of catastrophe. Pericles' strategy for the Peloponnesian War, the conflict with Sparta that begins in 431 BC, the year before the plague, is specifically designed around Athens' strengths and weaknesses. Athens cannot defeat Sparta on land. The Spartan army is the finest infantry force in the Greek world, and Athenian citizen soldiers cannot match it in open battle. Pericles' strategy is therefore to refuse battle entirely, to pull the rural population of Attica inside the long walls, let the Spartans devastate the surrounding countryside without engaging them, maintain naval superiority, raid the Peloponnesian coast, and wait until Sparta exhausts itself against an enemy it cannot reach. The strategy is militarily rational. It is epidemiologically catastrophic. The population of Attica, the farmers and village communities of the surrounding countryside, floods into Athens when the Spartan army invades. The city, already dense, becomes desperately overcrowded. People are living in temporary shelters between the long walls. The water supply, adequate for the normal population, is strained beyond capacity. The sanitation system, primitive by any modern standard, is overwhelmed. The living conditions that Pericles' strategy requires, maximum concentration of population in a confined space with inadequate water, food, and sanitation, are precisely the conditions that allow a respiratory and gastrointestinal disease to spread with maximum efficiency. When the plague arrives through Piraeus, it does not encounter a population distributed across the countryside in the villages and farms where at least some isolation is possible. It encounters 300,000 to 400,000 people packed into a space designed for a fraction of that number, sharing water sources, sleeping in close proximity, and having no concept of contagion or quarantine that might limit the spread. The account that Thucydides provides of the plague in his History of the Peloponnesian War is one of the most extraordinary documents in ancient literature, a clinical, precise, first-person observation of mass death that reads, in its combination of medical detail and social analysis, like nothing else written before the modern era. Thucydides contracts the disease himself and survives. This gives him a specific authority. He describes the symptoms from the inside, not as an observer watching others die, but as someone who has experienced the progression and lived to write it down. The symptoms he describes are ferocious. It begins with intense heat in the head. The eyes become red and inflamed. The throat and tongue bleed. Sneezing and hoarseness follow. The disease descends to the chest, producing violent coughing. The stomach convulses with vomiting. The body breaks out in pustules and ulcers. Patients cannot bear clothing on their skin because of the heat. They throw themselves into cisterns trying to cool themselves. Most die between the 7th and 9th day of the illness. Those who survive past 9 days often lose fingers, toes, genitals, or eyesight to the disease as it destroys extremities. Some lose their memory. The identification of this disease has occupied medical historians for 2.5 millennia. Every plague pathogen has been proposed: smallpox, typhus, bubonic plague, Ebola, measles, toxic shock syndrome. A 2006 DNA analysis of teeth from a mass burial site in the Kerameikos cemetery identified genetic material consistent with typhoid fever. Most experts now lean toward typhoid or a typhoid-like illness, possibly combined with another pathogen. The specific identification remains uncertain. What is not uncertain is the mortality. Thucydides says the disease kills indiscriminately. Healthy and sick, young and old, physicians who go to treat the patients and die alongside them. The bodies pile up faster than the living can dispose of them. People burn the dead on funeral pyres they have not built themselves, laying their own dead on pyres already burning. In the harbour district of Piraeus, where the disease arrives first, entire blocks of the population die within weeks. The mortality is devastating. What Thucydides identifies as equally devastating is the social consequence, the specific way in which the plague destroys not just bodies, but the civic culture that Athens has been building for 50 years. Thucydides describes a phenomenon that modern sociologists call enemy, the dissolution of social norms under conditions of extreme stress. The Athenians who watch their neighbors die begin to reason that the normal rules of behavior no longer apply. If a man is healthy today and dead tomorrow, why defer gratification? Why maintain property rights when the owner may be dead by the time the debt is called? Why observe the religious customs that govern burial and mourning when there are too many dead to bury properly and the gods appear to be striking down the pious and impious with equal indifference? The sanctuaries, the temples that are the sacred spaces of Athenian civic life, fill with the dying and the dead because people carry relatives to the gods they can no longer save and then die themselves before they can retrieve them. The religious orders that govern behavior in the sanctuaries cease to function when the priests themselves are dying. Law enforcement collapses. People who believe they will die soon, and who have watched enough of their neighbors die to make this a reasonable belief, do not defer to laws whose enforcement depends on the willingness of other people to risk their own health to maintain them. The economic system that depends on trust, on the enforcement of contracts, on the predictability of institutional behavior, begins to fray as the institutions themselves lose personnel and legitimacy simultaneously. Pericles attempts to maintain the functioning of democratic institutions through the plague. He continues to speak in the assembly, to direct military operations, to hold the democratic system together through the force of his authority and the persuasiveness of his rhetoric. His famous funeral oration, delivered in the first year of the war before the plague arrives, is the most celebrated speech in ancient Greek history, a statement of Athenian democratic values so complete and so eloquent that it has served as a template for democratic self-justification ever since. In that speech, Pericles tells the Athenians that their city is an education to Greece, that the way of life Athens has created is the model toward which all other cities are reaching without yet knowing it. By 429 BC, the man who delivered that speech is dead of the plague. The assembly that he addressed meets with depleted membership, its procedures disrupted by a health crisis that its rules contain no mechanism for managing. The courts continue to function, but the citizens who staff the juries are dying. The religious calendar that organizes Athenian civic life, the festivals, the sacrifices, the dramatic performances that are simultaneously religious events and cultural expressions, is disrupted as priests die and sanctuaries fill with the unburied dead. Pericles dies of the plague in 429 BC. He is one of perhaps 75,000 to 100,000 Athenians who die in the epidemic's first 2 years. His death removes the one figure capable of holding the democratic system together through sheer personal authority during a crisis that is destroying the civic culture the democracy depends on. The plague does not only destroy Athenian society, it destroys Athenian strategy. Pericles' war plan depends on the fleet. The fleet requires trained rowers and sailors, men who have spent years developing the specific skills that Athenian naval supremacy requires. A trireme is not sailed by conscripts. It is rowed by 170 trained oarsmen who must maintain a coordination and pace that can only be developed through extended practice. The Athenian fleet's technical superiority over Spartan and allied naval forces is a product of decades of accumulated human capital, the specific knowledge and physical capability of the men who row it. The plague kills approximately a quarter of the Athenian citizen population. Among the fleet's rowers, crowded together in the close quarters of their ships and the harbors where they are stationed, the mortality is proportionally higher. The naval expeditions that Pericles launches in 430 BC carry the plague with them to the allied cities of the Aegean, alienating the very communities whose continued loyalty Athens depends on to maintain the empire that funds the war effort. In 430 BC, an Athenian fleet sent to the Peloponnesian coast is struck by plague during the campaign. The soldiers and sailors who return carry the disease back to the city. The military losses from plague exceed the military losses from combat in the first years of the war. An army of 4,000 hoplites sent to Potidea in northern Greece loses 1,050 men to plague in a single campaign, losses that in combat would represent a catastrophic defeat, but are simply absorbed as the cost of maintaining the siege. The manpower shortage that the plague creates forces Athens to reassess the strategy that Pericles had built on Athens' demographic advantages. With a quarter of the population dead, the tax base that funds the fleet contracts, the tribute from allied cities, already strained by the costs of the war, comes under pressure as the plague spreads through the Aegean and disrupts the agricultural and commercial economies of the allied communities. The financial architecture of Athenian imperial power is being damaged not at its military periphery, but at its metropolitan center. The plague runs for approximately 4 years, 430 to 426 BC, with a second wave in 427 to 426 BC that may be as deadly as the first. By the time it exhausts itself, Athens has lost between a quarter and a third of its total population and a disproportionate share of its experienced military and civic leadership. The city survives. The Peloponnesian War continues for another 20 years. Athens loses that war ultimately, not directly because of the plague, but in the specific ways that the plague makes defeat more likely. The manpower losses constrain military options. The death of Pericles opens the way for a different kind of democratic leadership. The demagogues whom Thucydides despises, men who play to popular sentiment rather than managing it, who make the catastrophic decision to send the Sicilian expedition in 415 BC and lose the finest army and fleet Athens possesses in a military disaster from which the city never fully recovers. The cultural productivity that defines the Golden Age continues after the plague. The tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides, the philosophy of Socrates, the construction of the Parthenon, which is completed in 432 BC and survives the plague intact. But the specific combination of confidence, wealth, democratic vitality, and imperial expansion that had produced the building program, the philosophy, and the drama is gone. What follows the plague is a city that is still extraordinary by any standard, but is fighting for survival rather than expressing the creative energy of a civilization at its peak. Thucydides, who survives the plague and lives to see the defeat of Athens in 404 BC, writes his history with the specific purpose of explaining how a city that was the most powerful in the Greek world in 430 BC was defeated by 404 BC. The plague is not his only explanation, but it is the first catastrophe in his account. The event that disrupts the Periclean strategy, kills the city's greatest leader, and begins the dissolution of the social fabric that democratic governance requires to function. The Parthenon stands, the democracy ends. The golden age closes with the sound of the dying in the streets and the smell of the pyres burning in the harbor district of Piraeus, and the historian who survives it writes it all down so that the people who come after will understand what was lost. It takes the modern world 2,400 years to build something comparable to what Athens had in 430 BC. Even now, we are not certain we have fully managed it.